Joining us now for World Brief and the review of some of the headlines of today's newspapers from around the world is Adefemi Akinsanya. Good morning, Adefemi. How are you this morning?
Good morning. I'm okay, Dr. Rubin. Thank you very much for asking. It's very, very cold. And, you know, as a Nigerian, I've really been suffering. I had to take off my coat so I can look presentable, but it's very cold. It's a very foggy morning in London. Good morning to you, Ayo. Good morning to you, Rufai. I hope you're all doing well in the warmth of Lagos there. Let me tell you what is happening around the world. Thank you. I appreciate it. I appreciate it. The love is keeping me warm. Let me tell you what's happening around the world. We'll start in the Middle East, where news that Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar has been killed. It's a discovery that Israeli Defense Forces were able to stumble across. They came across his body when they were going through some rubble and were able to identify him as Yahya Sinwar, who is a senior leader in Hamas and also believed to be one of the spearheading motivations behind the October 7th attack. It's a discovery that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has lauded, has celebrated. He's commended the Israeli Defense Forces. But if anybody was hoping that with the coming of this death would mean a ceasefire is likely to materialize, you would be disappointed, because Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says that this war is not going to end and that he will continue fighting this war until every Israeli hostage is returned dead or alive. This is of course going to be disappointing to people who were hoping for a ceasefire. The United States, for example, had been trying to broker this latest development into an ability to see if there's more appetite from the Israelis for a ceasefire, but it doesn't look as though that is what we are seeing here. So again, this war will continue. And just to remind you that the death toll in Gaza is 42,000. To put this number into context, yes, the 42,000 does include Hamas fighters, but the number of civilians, men, women and children who have nothing to do with the frontline fighting is the lion's share of that 42,000 death toll, and it is a tragedy all the same. So that's what's happening in the Middle East. If we move on to the African continent now, how do we say, is it it don't cast, like it has happened, or it has happened? Rigathi Gachagua. It's happened, right? Rigathi Gachagua in Kenya, he has been impeached. He had been fighting tooth and nail, fighting for his political life, but unfortunately for him, the Senate has gone ahead and voted to impeach him. Now, this news came while he was in hospital. He wasn't there in person. His legal representation were in the vicinity, and they had been calling on the Senate to allow them to make their final decision in Saturday. There is a legal space for them to do so, but they chose to go ahead, even though Gachagua was not present and was allegedly in hospital. The Senate decided to go ahead and impeach him. And if anything, it just shows how determined they were to get rid of him. I know, Rufai, you mentioned that this was all but certain, that there was no doubt that Gachagua was going to go, but it does seem as though for him now, this is quite disappointing, especially since he wasn't there in person. So that's what we're seeing on the African continent. And then if we now look at Martinique, Martinique is a French colony in the Caribbean, and for weeks there's been unrest, there's been protests, because many of the people there are tired of the cost of living, the inflation, but especially the cost of food on that island nation. As a result, the island's prefect, his name is Jean-Christophe Bouvier, he has agreed to cut prices. He says that this deal will be around will mean a 20% reduction in the price of 6,000 key imports. But for the people who have been protesting, especially the organizers of the protest, they say that this deal is coming too little, too late. They say that there is no reason why the French people in Martinique, the Martinique people are paying so much more for French products than is being paid for on the French mainland. So that's what we're seeing, a whole lot of infighting. Definitely looting has continued in Martinique, protests have continued, and these protests have also turned deadly. So again, when we're looking at this cost of living crisis, it's something that is affecting the whole world, and we can see it there. Ayo, I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts on the World Brief before we move on to the papers.
All right, so many important stories to touch on. In Martinique, you're absolutely right. They pay almost 20 to 40% more than the cost of French-made products in mainland France. And so not very sure if this move by the prefect, as it's called, of that precinct would make any difference, despite the lives that have been lost and properties destroyed. But let me go to the big story this morning. And of course, that is the killing of Yahya Sinwar. A lot of things in terms of his background, and like you rightly mentioned, most importantly is, what does this signify? He was called the butcher of Khan Yunis, where he was born, because of the amount of people he had killed who had served as spies from Israel to Hamas. He was once, previously the military commander of Hamas before Ismail Haniyeh was killed early August, before he then became the military and political leader there. And now this killing is said to be one of a critical moment in Israel's war against Hamas. But the big question then would be, what is the way forward? What happens after this killing? The United States, as well as other Western allies, have continued to put pressure. In fact, President Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris's response to this killing was that, finally, hopefully, the Israelis and those who were affected by the October 7 killings of 1,200 Israelis, which they say he masterminded, would now find some form of closure, and that perhaps this would be the opening of a conversation around negotiations and ceasefire. But Benjamin Netanyahu has been quite adamant in the aims for this war. One is the release of the hostages, which hasn't happened. About 100 are still in captivity. Yes. And number two, of course, is just the decimation and the total, total annihilation of Hamas as a political and ideological body in the Middle East region. So despite this win, as has been touted, unfortunately, it doesn't seem to be the beginning of the end of this war, which a lot of people are now calling forward, especially as a result of some of the concerns around humanitarian abuses by Israel, aid getting to Gaza, aid getting to the people of Palestine. But for Yahya himself, since, I think, in the 90s, the Israelis have killed the leaders of Hamas. They've eliminated leaders of Hamas, but they've always found a way to replace the leaders. After Haniyeh came Sinwar, and so it's important to just mention that as well. But what people are looking for is, what would this mean? Would we finally get to that negotiation table in the Middle East?
Well, we'll have to wait and see. Thank you very much for your analysis, Ayo. Dr. Rubin and Rufaya, we'll come back to you, but let's take a look at the papers and see what is happening around the world on the front pages of those dailies. We begin in Nigeria with the front page of This Day, and This Day leads with, as you've already mentioned, the World Bank, and the World Bank has been urging the Nigerian federal government to conduct an audit in order to determine how much the NNPC owes the Federation. The bank also called for better reporting of oil revenues. All of these recommendations are found in the Nigeria Development Update, a report which was launched by the World Bank over there in Abuja earlier. Moving on to the Nigerian Tribune now. The Tribune also looks at the World Bank and what they've got to say about the Nigerian economy. It also includes a response by Bauchi State Governor, who says that economic reforms as they stand in Nigeria just aren't working. Moving on to the New Telegraph now, and the New Telegraph says that the banking disruptions that many Nigerians have been experiencing for at least a week have been due to banks trying to update their software and upgrade their software offerings. Now, lenders say that they have lost billions to hackers because of this, and that's why they're focusing on upgrading their software. And also, they list the fact that the banking sector has been facing the technology challenges due to a lack of proper government policy when it comes to software application in the country. So hopefully, if these disruptions will come to an end very, very soon. Moving on to the Daily Independent now, and that looks at the 14,237 cases of cholera, which has resulted in 378 deaths from across Nigeria. Now, the NCDC, the Nigeria Center for Disease Control, has attributed this scourge to the rise of flooding incidents. And speaking of flooding incidents, to the top of the Daily Independent, the top left-hand corner, we can see that there are people who have been warned to leave the Benue River Basin over fears that those waters will burst its banks very soon. Moving on to The Guardian now, and The Guardian looks ahead to the 4th anniversary of the #EndSARS protests, which were put down, as we know, by lethal force on the 20th of October 2020. Now, the 4th anniversary will take place this Sunday, but ahead of that, its headline says, a spectre of abuses and bad leadership is haunting Nigeria, still haunting Nigeria 4 years later. And as you can see, the front page of The Guardian has a caricature of Lady Justice being held back by the thumb, dressed in a federal uniform, and we all know what that and who that represents. Moving on lastly to our last Nigerian paper this morning, The Punch takes a look at skyrocketing inflation, quoting the World Bank, of course, which says that 129 million people have been trapped in poverty. Also on the front page of The Punch, we see Governor of Rivers State, Sim Fubara. He has offered 100 scholarships to people studying at Wigwe University. So just a positive story update there that we're seeing happening at Wigwe University. If we move on to our African papers now, of course, the Daily Nation of Kenya, we can all guess what its front page is going to be, and it's a very, very simple one-word headline: fired. Rigathi Gachagua has gone. And then also, if we move on to Ghana, we can see that the political madness is not just in Kenya or in any other place. We see it also happening in Ghana. And the Speaker of Parliament in Ghana has declared 4 seats in Parliament vacant after the current occupants of those seats have defected in order to declare their interest in the presidential and other elections that are taking place on the 7th of December this year. Let's move on to our British papers. We'll just take one. The Metro, unsurprisingly, in the UK, leads with an account of the final hours of Liam Payne, who is believed to have died after falling from the 3rd floor of a hotel in the Argentinian capital, Buenos Aires, a few days ago. It's believed that he was under the influence of drugs and alcohol when this tragic incident happened. But the front page of many British dailies are looking at his death, and also have featured the tributes that have been pouring in, his former bandmates and fans around the world, all of them paying their final respects at this point to Liam Payne.
I mean, very sad one there. Real quickly, a couple of things, and congrats to Wigwe University. I mean, I remember when that process started with Professor Miles, as regards those 100 students that have been sponsored by Governor Fubara out of Rivers State, and I'm happy that has finally fallen in place. Also, as regards the killing of Sinwar, I mean, what life. He was in Israeli prison for over 20 years, after plotting an attack on the Israelis many years ago.
Yes.
In prison, he learned Hebrew. He got on to be the leader after Haniyeh has been, killed also by the Israeli. He went ahead. It was said that the Israeli forces actually targeted him. There's a video circulating now that he was seen on a chair. His arms was already broken and all of that. And the Israeli forces had a drone in there that saw him. He threw a stick at the drone, and the next thing they bombarded that place and they got his body out of the rubble. Yeah. Finally, for some time, they couldn't confirm the death, but afterwards, they have confirmed the death after the DNA samples and all of that. But will this end the crisis? No. And the most important thing we should look at is life after Hamas in the Gaza Strip. That's going to be another question. Don't forget, Israel had occupied the Gaza Strip all this while before they yielded power to Hamas, and Hamas won elections in 05, 06. And since then, Hamas has reigned large in that area. So what's going to be the future in that area? Because, obviously Israel controls the West Bank, with Fatah in there. So the future of that region. Yeah. And, the Iranians has been talking that this is also going to prop up the resistance. As regards Gachagua, like you said rightly, he don't cast. We knew what was going to happen. And that's the beginning of the end. That's what you get when you are disloyal, to your boss.
Well, Gachagua the lower parliament voted to impeach him last week, setting the stage for the impeachment process by the Senate this week. And now his lawyer said, well, he had gone to the hospital having chest pain, and that he was being treated in the hospital, so he couldn't show up. The lawyers asked for, the trial to be done, on Saturday, which the Senate refused, and they staged a walkout. Now, at the end of the day, 2/3 of the 7 members of the upper house of parliament in Kenya voted to impeach him on 6 charges. Ethnic division, violating his oath of office, which they said was enough to get him impeached. The other 5 charges about corruption, money laundering, those were dismissed. So what next? What is next is that he's out. The 2-year alliance between him and Ruto has ended. Ruto has successfully consolidated his hold on power. Now, 2 governors have been considered to replace him, and also the Interior Minister and the Foreign Affairs Minister. As for the prefecture of Martinique, the word is prefecture. There is a law, a 17th century 9% import tax law, which is like a levy in place. And then 2, there are intermediaries. 80% of the products from that serve the people of Martinique 360,000 of them are imported from France. And now they say they pay 40% more than the people in France. As a result of this, the people have been protesting. The prefect, that is the officer in charge of Martinique, says, well, they've worked out a deal which would cover 2,000 items. But, you know, the alliance, the RFPXC, which is the body for protecting the interests of the Afro-Caribbean people, says no. 80% of all the products, up to about 6,000, must have their cost reduced. And, you know, this is where we are in this regard. Yes. But the issue, of course, is that this is about relationship between France and its, you know, colonies, former colonies or prefectures. And France seems to be losing out, you know, either in West Africa or also in the Caribbean, as we have seen with the example of Martinique.
Well, thank you very much, Adefemi. Stay warm and enjoy the weekend.